All right, guys, so I really wish I could be there in class to go over your quiz with you and pep talk you for tomorrow's test, but since I'm at a training trying to make myself a better teacher for all y'all, this is kind of the next best thing that I could think of. So as we go through this, I want you guys to write some of the strategy that I show you and the tricks so that you're most prepared for tomorrow's test. That being said, a couple of these questions I'm just going to skim quickly through because if you got them wrong, don't worry about it. It's not the type of question that I would ask you on the test. But some of these look very similar to test questions you'll see tomorrow. So I want to make sure that we talk through those and we fix any mistakes that we may have made so that we're ready to go for tomorrow's test. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at this first question. We've talked about before I even read the question, I want to brain dump what I know. So looking at an energy pyramid, I know that my most energy is always on the bottom of the pyramid, which makes sense. It's the biggest part of the pyramid. So I know here's my most energy. So that would mean up here at the top, this is my least energy. And since we're talking about energy, I'm going to go ahead and show I know 10% goes from one level to the next. And 90% is going to get lost as heat. Okay, so we're going to add a 10% here. The only other thing that I want to go ahead and write on here is I know my producers or my autotrophs, things that can make their own food, are always going to be on the bottom. So they have the most energy, and then these all have to be my consumers. So now that I've brain dumped everything I know and I can look back at this through the rest of my test, I'm going to read the question. So which of these trophic levels has the least amount of energy available? Well, I know this guy up here has the least amount. So it says tertiary consumer, producer, secondary, or primary. Well, I know my producer has the most energy, so I'm going to scratch that one. But using these other labels, if this is my producer, these must be my first consumers, so I'm going to call them primary consumers, which would make these secondary, tertiary, just meaning the third, and then quaternary, meaning the fourth. So I can scratch primary, secondary. My least energy would be up here at the quaternary, but that's not an option. So out of the options, my tertiary consumer, this fish right here, would have the least energy because it's closest to the top. All right, now, number 2, a tick feeding on the blood of a dog is an example of. All right, as soon as I see these words, I know that this is a symbiosis question. So I'm going to make my T-chart. I have the dog, I have the tick, and I'm going to put my tricks. So commensalism, I know as soon as I see this 0 or this O, it's plus 0. Parasitism is the one we all know that a parasite's a bad thing, so it has to be someone's a frowny face. Neutralism, they're just tricking me. There's no such thing as neutralism. And mutualism, I turn my U's into the smiley faces. Now, a tick feeding on the blood of a dog. My dog is going to be harmed in this. He doesn't want to lose blood. My tick is going to be happy in this. He's getting food. So this is parasitism, which I'm sure you guys all did a great job on. You guys are really strong when it comes to symbiosis. All right, looking at number 3, I don't want you to worry too much about this. A food chain and a food web are different because, okay, so remember my web's the one with all the complex arrows, and this feeds on this, and this, and this, and a chain is like this, just one linear line. The loss of energy as heat is not really being shown in either of these. The total biomass at each trophic level, I don't see the biomass in a web, that's in a pyramid. Complexity, this is my keyword. Food webs are complex, food chains are simple. So C is the correct response here. The flow of energy is represented by an arrow, and I have an arrow in both my food chains and my food webs. So I know that's not the correct difference. All right, but again, I won't really ask you a similarity and difference between food chains and food webs. Number 4, I see these words again, so I know this is symbiosis. I have a bee that's feeding on a flower. So as soon as I say that the bee is feeding, the bee's happy, because he's getting food. And for my flower, we've talked about flowers need their pollen to go from one flower to another in order to reproduce. So if it's the flower and this is helping me reproduce, this is a benefit for me too. My smiley faces plus means it must be mutualism. Okay, good. So these are our first 4. Moving on to question number 5. I'm going to try and zoom out here so you guys can see the question. In a pond, the primary producer is green algae. This right here, Spirongia, I'm not quite sure how to say it. Guys, this is just a name. It starts with a capital letter. It's giving you the name of the algae. Don't worry about it. Just scratch it out. So my producer is the algae. My food chains always start with the producers. So I've got my algae. The primary consumer is the crustacean, Daphnia, which again, this is just a name. I don't care. I'm just going to call it my crustacean. Then my secondary consumer, so I've got my primary, my secondary is a small fish, the bluegill. So I'm just going to put small fish and scratch out bluegill. I don't need that. I'll just call them small fish. And the tertiary, my third one, is a larger fish, the smallmouth bass. I'm just going to put large fish because a smallmouth large fish confuses me. So I'm just going to call it the large fish. Okay, so now I've read the question and I've pulled out my food chain based on the information in the question. So now it says, what changes can we expect if the Daphnia are killed? Okay, well, my Daphnia I scratched out. That was the crustacean. So these guys are being killed. They've got to go. I want to see tomorrow on your test, when you do a food chain, go ahead and predict what changes are going to happen, and then you just choose what answer matches up with that. So if my crustaceans are gone, my crustaceans are feeding on the algae. So no crustaceans, no one eating algae, I'm going to see more algae. Okay. On the opposite, my crustacean is giving energy to the small fish. This is what the small fish eats. So no crustaceans, no food for small fish, they're going to be less. Okay, so using that, let's see if something matches up. The Spirongia population will die. Well, that was my algae, and I said I should have more of them, so that one doesn't make sense. The bluegill population will increase. My bluegill was the small fish, and they're going to decrease. So that doesn't make sense. The Daphnia population will eat something else. I cannot assume that is the case. If it's not given to me in the problem, I can't assume that's true. So then D, the smallmouth bass will die. Smallmouth bass, that's my larger fish. Well, if I have less of these guys, it only makes sense that there's less food for these guys. So they will decrease too. Okay, this is a really challenging question because it uses those names, and if you read this sentence incorrectly, you might have thought that those were different organisms, that the crustacean and the Daphnia were two different things. Okay, but using this strategy will help you a lot tomorrow if you'll go ahead and predict what's going to happen. Okay, all right, looking at number 6, this is what you did yesterday when you guys were looking at biomes. I'm not going to ask you a biomes question, but grazing means they're eating grass, so the most grazing animals are in the grasslands. Okay, but don't worry about that one. All right, number 7. This is my food web. It's complex. I know my producers are here on the bottom. So always a pattern. Producers are always on the bottom, or they're always the first. Now, based on this food web, which two animals are competing for the same food source? So I need two animals that eat the same thing. If I look at the hawk and I look at the frog, they are nowhere close to eating the same thing. So that one doesn't make sense. The rabbit, I backtrack. Rabbit is eating grass. The cricket, I backtrack. Here's the cricket. It gets energy from the grass. So if they're both eating grass, they're in competition for that food source. Okay? Best practice, you would want to check these other two, but since I'm short on time, I know as soon as I see two animals in competition for the same food source, rabbit and cricket was your correct response, B. All right, here we go. Symbiosis again. And guys, there'll be 5 questions of symbiosis on your test, so you've got to know what these words mean. Which of the following relationships is an example of mutualism? Well, mutualism, I know, smiley face, smiley face. So I'm looking for a plus, plus. This they made way too easy because they went ahead and gave you what the relationship symbols are. So this is commensalism. B shows me mutualism, plus plus, and D shows me mutualism, plus plus. These that have the 0, like we said, are commensalism. And the negative is parasitism. Okay, it's only asking mutualism, so B and D. A is my correct response. Okay, so hopefully these symbiosis questions you guys are feeling good about. If not, you just need to memorize what those terms, which one's plus plus, which one's plus minus. Okay, number 9, you guys have to assume a food chain that they didn't necessarily tell you. So looking at this, which would be the effect of a reduction in the producers in this meadow? So I'm looking at this meadow, and I know as soon as I see producers, producers are plants. So I'm going to have some kind of plant, and I know what are things that eat plants. Well, I could have a rabbit eats a plant, some insects eat plants, right? Deer can eat a plant. All right, so let's look at the options because I can't really brain dump much more until I see what my options are. So I'm reducing my producers. So my plants are going away. So is that going to increase the snakes? Well, snakes aren't eating plants, but snakes could eat some of these guys. And if there's no producers, there's going to be less of all of these guys. So I think if all of these get eaten by snakes, oops, if I could write the word snake, draw a picture. You guys know I love pictures. Okay, so if there's less of the, oh, that's a terrible looking snake. If there's less of these guys, then there has to be less snakes. Food source, food source. So this one doesn't make sense. They're not going to increase. A rabbit population would increase. Well, I did say rabbits would eat plants, but if there's no plants, there's going to be less rabbits. They're not going to increase. Grasshoppers would multiply rapidly. Well, I think a grasshopper would be here in the insects, but again, if I don't have plants for the grasshoppers to eat, I don't have any evidence that there's going to be more grasshoppers. So I'm going to scratch that. Rabbit population would decrease. I predicted rabbits would eat plants. If there's no plants, less rabbits. I like that one. Okay. All right. Which statement describes activity that is directly involved in the nitrogen cycle? Guys, I told you one word. When we think nitrogen, we think bacteria. Okay, when we think nitrogen, we think bacteria. Think about the little brain pop guys that have the little wiggly arms, right? And in our diagram, we circled the word bacteria, bacteria, bacteria. So plants release water into the atmosphere through transpiration. I see this word water. That has nothing to do with nitrogen. A doesn't make sense. Okay? A trout, which is just a fish, excretes, so it gets rid of waste, carbon dioxide into the water. Carbon dioxide is part of my carbon cycle. It's asking me about nitrogen. A crow uses carbs for cell metabolism. I have no idea what this word means. If I'm you guys, I do know, but let's just pretend. I don't know what this word means, so I can't really say yes or no. But I look at D and I see soil bacteria convert ammonia into a material. Well, I remember we talked about, I brought my pesos from Argentina and I couldn't use them because I had to convert them. So if I'm changing, I see bacteria, this is my best response. Okay. All right. Number 11, cleaning up the Gulf. Toxins are killing algae. What will this have on the ecosystem? Algae is a producer. So I'm going to start with the algae. If they are killing off the algae, these would be my primary consumers that feed on the algae. Oops. If I have no algae, I'm going to have less of these guys. Again, guys, make your predictions before you look at the options. So would there be an increase in the primary consumers? No. Opposite. An increase in oxygen levels? No. That has nothing to do with what we're talking about. A decrease in the primary consumers? Decreasing means less. Yes. This is my